And this military buildup, I feel like it could actually be something very similar to semiconductor-related dynamics that you were laying out earlier, because it could actually bolster a lot of these countries, not just the U.S. and China, but bolster a lot of these other countries to really build up on their own defense. Obviously, that's what's been happening. And it's not really the idea that they can actually rely on either one of these two.
Well, nobody's relying on China. China's largely relying on itself. I mean, if you look around the region, they don't have traditional treaty allies in the way the United States does. The United States, as a military provider, has a fairly diverse set of partners in this part of the world. Japan, it has 5 treaty allies: Japan, Australia, South Korea, Thailand, and the Philippines. Those are very diverse relationships if you think about it. I mean, Thailand is not an ally in the way it was in the 1960s and 70s. South Korea very much focused on the North Korea challenge. We talked a little bit about Australia before and some of the operational challenges. Japan, obviously critical to American defense planning and war plans for the region in every conceivable contingency, and that relationship developing as well. But I think what you've put your finger on is the fact that the region is increasingly unstable, and therefore countries are increasingly attuned to security concerns. And that's really a trend line of the last decade or so, and it's one that's concerning. Because if you think about the history of the region from, say, the Asian financial crisis in 1997-98 to roughly 2008 or the middle of that next decade, economic Asia, the growing integration of Asian economies, was decidedly winning the contest with this security fragmentation. But in this push and pull between economic integration and security fragmentation, security's really roared back with a vengeance. And some of the most tense security relationships, for instance, between China and Japan, or China and India, are, at least in the former case, examples of countries that also have pretty tight trade or robust investment relationships. And so that's concerning, and I think that's what a lot of countries are trying to hedge against. And that's why, to go back to where we started the conversation, the United States is banking so heavily on its security role to keep it central in the region. But as I was saying to Martin, I just don't think that's enough over the long term.
And this is a conversation maybe 5-10 years ago with a China watcher, and he was basically saying, look, China could be assertive in the region, but it's not aggressive just yet. Do you think that is changing, and do you think that could quickly change?
Well, I'm not sure that every government in the region would share that particular framing of that. There are countries that view China as quite aggressive. I don't know if you've talked to anyone in Manila lately, but the view there is that the Chinese are quite aggressive in their use of, for example, fishing fleets, or what we call white hulls, Coast Guard vessels, as opposed to just gray hulls, Navy vessels. And that's what's driving the trend line that you had before. I think that brings us back to the U.S.-China thing. What countries don't want is to get caught betwixt and between. And if I think about the central strategic dynamic in Asia, it's really this tension between economic integration and security fragmentation, where the same countries that are trading, building, investing, and growing together are also beset by border disputes, security tensions, territorial ambitions, and pathologies that we thought were frozen in time have really roared back to the fore with a vengeance. So I think countries are thinking hard about what kind of region and what kind of future they want to have, and that's the prism through which they're looking at the United States and China. The good news for the United States in the past was the United States was viewed largely as a benign power, not an unself-interested power, but one that was interested in providing public goods to the region. And that's where, as I was saying earlier, I think a lot of what's happening represents a kind of crisis of confidence in the way that Asians look at the United States. It's not the first time that's happened. In 1975, after the Vietnam War ended, a lot of people in Asia worried the U.S. was just going to withdraw from the region. And the United States got over that hump. In 1997-98, the U.S. bailed out Mexico, and then 3 years after 1994, when it did that, refused to bail out Thailand, and that raised a lot of questions about America's economic commitment in the region. Now, the U.S. is facing a kind of third crisis of confidence, where people are saying, do you just view us as proxies in your competition with China? You're going to keep your market open? Do you want to provide public goods? Or do you just want to sail boats around and hope we're going to come along with you for the ride? That's what the United States is better positioned, frankly, than China to answer questions about from countries in the region. But as I was implying before, I I don't think either the United States or China has answered those questions very well. But it is true there are acute security fears of China across the region, and that's partly what the U.S. is trying to ride. There are those who view China as being quite aggressive, not just assertive.
Yeah, and I want to marry these to two different threads, one on semiconductor and two on military, and to marry the two. And, you know, this is really the military modernization of China that the U.S. is trying to stop. I think that's the reason why we're seeing all these chip export controls coming out to left and right. It doesn't really matter which administration. Do you think that it's to the point, the military modernization and the commitment of Xi Jinping to that goal is to the point where the U.S. is just not going to be able to control?
Well, I think the U.S. is going to try to control the flow of a lot of technologies, but also knowledge flow to China. And that's the trend line of the last decade. It's not just about Trump. It's not just about Biden. It's been a progressive, what I would call not militarization, but securitization of the entire U.S.-China relationship in ways that, frankly, were unthinkable when I got into this business 30 years ago, 25-year career in U.S.-China relations. Technology, as you're implying, is particularly vulnerable to that. And a lot of that, it's not about ideology, it's about the nature of the technology itself. If I think about a lot of the emerging and foundational technologies of the future, artificial intelligence-enabled applications, new composite and synthetic materials, nanotechnology, quantum computing, all of these things are remarkable in the commercial sphere. You can do amazing things with fast computing, for instance, in the biomedical sciences for clinical trials, but you can also do amazing things to simulate nuclear weapons testing. And so all of these technologies are dual use in application. And so, as really you're implying, the American impulse progressively has been to control the flow of these things and to use administrative and regulatory instruments to make sure that's the case, and then to extraterritorialize U.S. export controls to bring pressure on third parties to bear. So really what we have, if you think about it as a kind of Venn diagram, is an American impulse to control and then a Chinese impulse to indigenize. And at the interstices of those two things is this push and pull between American policy and Chinese policy, with a lot of countries getting caught in that. I don't think you can generalize from semiconductors. I think China's progress is highly variable, and you have to go sector by sector. But the United States is entirely too dismissive of China's technology progress. And I think in the chip area, it's been harder for China than it's been in some other areas, like, let's say, EV batteries, where they control a lot of the processing and also a lot of the technological innovation. But you really have to look at that on a granular basis. But I don't think anything's going to knock the United States or Mr. Xi off the dynamic course that we're on right now.